Greetings and salutations, everyone. Today we're going to take a look at the United States as a nation and what we did to secure the Republic. We're going to see the various steps we took in international affairs and domestic affairs at the end of the 18th and dawn of the 19th century. So, let's get started. On April 30th, 1789, the first president, George Washington, took the oath of office. This was a real easy decision to decide who would become the first president. Yes, Washington did have to run, but he was so immensely popular from the 7 Years' War, from the Revolutionary War, from his time as a gentleman landowner, from his ideas of what made a man. Him running, it was a shutout. The thing that we see from this, a couple of things. First off is the idea that he takes the oath of office in April. Nowadays it happens in January, and that's because it's much colder in January than it is in April. And in the 18th century, there was no central heating system. So if you had your populace standing out in the middle of the cold, they'd, as they say, catch their death. So that's why it happens in April and why it's okay for it to happen now in January. Prior to the creation of the head of the executive branch, prior to the creation of the office of the president, the person who's in charge of the nation was the moderator of the Continental Congress. And this person was also called president, but they are two entirely separate roles. With Washington taking the highest office in the land, there was a couple of questions to ask as well and need answers. Like, among many, what do we call the president? And there were a couple of titles knocked around, Mr. President, Your Excellency, the esteemed high office of blah, blah, blah. Ultimately, it was settled on just Mr. President, a title that was simple and denoted the idea that you were a servant of the people. Now, underneath the president and within the executive branch are the various different departments and cabinet positions that are created. These are responsible for micromanaging the different components of the federal government. This way you don't have one person with all authority. And the person who's usually in charge of each of these different departments and branches and departments and cabinets is supposed to be somebody who is knowledgeable and skillful in that field. The first three departments under the executive branch will be the Department of State, and they're going to handle what we do with other nations. The Department of War, how we will defend our nation, what we now call the Department of Defense, and the Treasury Department, and this group is responsible for overseeing the finances. We also see that the position of Attorney General will be quickly created, who will advise the President, and the Postmaster General, who makes sure that mail is delivered. And this isn't just mail, this is mail and news and packaging and all that significant materials. As first Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton had the responsibility of crafting a program that was going to make the United States a commercial and military power. And his program had a variety of different steps in it that was going to take us from a nation that said, hey, look at us, we exist, to being this real powerhouse. The first one was all individual state debt is going to disappear. That is now gone. The federal government would assume each state's debt. That is going to allow the states to have relatively no balance towards each other, while at the same reason, each state has to defer to a federal banking authority. And that will create the Bank of the United States. And the role of the Bank of the United States is going to be to issue notes for the federal government and to make loans from the federal government. Hamilton also wanted to create an excise tax, which would tax your domestically manufactured goods like whiskey, and we'll get into the whiskey tax here in just a few minutes. And then finally to impose tariffs on stuff that's coming into the country and provide subsidies on industries that are growing. And this plan would work. No part of it is an overnight transformation. All of it would ultimately also see the creation of the political party systems. Hamilton liked trade. He liked specifically trade with Britain. At this time, Britain was our biggest trading partner. And this is where we get opposition to Hamilton's plan. And the first real opposition to it came in the form of Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson and his guys liked the idea of agriculture instead of trade. Jefferson was worried that this new program is going to create a federal government that is too big, too strong, too wealthy, and too out of touch for the average person. And there was the fear that with the new national bank that was about to exist, you could buy bonds for almost nothing, wait a couple decades maybe, and turn around and make those bonds worth substantially more money. Hamilton's economic programs were very popular in the North because this is where we see this type of general business came from, and very unpopular in the South. Hamilton said that this economic program could work, and he justified why it was going to, no matter what, this is going to be the way of things, citing the General Welfare Clause of the Constitution. And this clause gives the federal government the ability to create programs that improve, quote, the general welfare of the people. It's vague and nebulous, and Hamilton used that fact to say, well, I am helping people and I'm helping their general welfare. Jefferson, however, believed in the strict wording of the Constitution. He said that if it is not in the Constitution, verbatim, word for word, we're not going to do it. And ultimately, we see that these two groups are going to come to a consensus on the plan. Hamilton is going to unroll his plan. Jefferson is going to call off the dogs, as it were. In exchange, the national capital will, for where the national capital will be placed, Washington, D.C. The idea of where the capital is had been knocked around for a while. Some people said it should be in New York. That was where our first capital was. Some said Philadelphia. Other people said Boston. But a new city on the Potomac between Maryland and Virginia is where the nation's capital district would be located. Briefly, I want to talk about the French Revolution, because it's important to see what's going on in France and how it will eventually affect the United States. In 1789, the French Revolution began, and it began for a lot of reasons. We're not going to go into too many details of the French Revolution today, but understand that the French were mostly heavily taxed, had no authority in their own government, had no say in the state, and were ruled under by an absolute king. A lot of the same stuff that we as a colony had been going through. And when we had enough, the United States said no more. We fought a revolutionary war based on the ideals of the Enlightenment, and we win. And the French look at this and say, wow, if the Americans can do this, then so can we. That's the motivator for the French Revolution. When things in France go to their more radical extreme, every part of the France was kind of up for debate on what we can do to change it. Like, they got rid of the king. They got rid of the calendar. They got rid of taxation rules. They start killing the top 5% of people in the country. They start you get my point. Everything is up for grabs. And France's old rivals, England and Prussia and briefly Spain, and even Austria, view, wow, it looks like France is collapsing, so let's go and attack France. Let's go carve a piece of France for ourselves, especially since the French government kind of is in a state of quasi-existence. France and England, and like I said, and Prussia and Austria and Spain are all at war with France right now. And we're in a really weird place during this time. See, at first we supported this revolution because it seemed like, hey, they're doing what we did, that's great. 4 years down the line, President Washington says we are going to act neutral in this. We are not going to get involved in taking a side with France or against France. We're not going to come to their aid, and we're also not going to send troops to go carve out a part of them. And this was kind of surprising because we needed France during the Revolutionary War. Without the French, we probably would not have won the war as quickly as we did. And now we're kind of turning our backs on them. And there's a lot of should we have done that, should we not have, but that was the decision. Things continue to go in a rough direction with us and the French and the British because we are selling stuff to anyone who will buy it, like American cotton, American tobacco, American rice. These are products that could sell in any market in the world. So it doesn't matter if you're British or French or Spanish or Prussian or Austrian. If you want to buy this stuff, then you're going to buy it. England starts confiscating stuff that's going to France from us, citing that, England is at war with France, this stuff was going to France, therefore it was going to the enemy, so England claims it as, theirs. And we respond to this by totally abandoning alliances with France, because by 1794, the French monarchy was now dead. The French people were in almost total uprising. The time of the terror, as it is called, had gripped the French people. And we weren't sure what France was going to look like when this whole thing was done. But we did know, no matter what, England is probably going to survive this. So we are willing to say, we'll see you on the other side of this, France. Hey, England, how's it going? Because they're going to be around when this is all over. France might not be. Okay, now that we understand what's going on with France and Hamilton's programs, it's now a good time to talk about political parties. And if we look at the 18th century, there are, just like now, two big political parties, the Federalists and the Republicans. And the Federalists were pro-Hamilton, pro-business, pro-British, pro-manufacturing, mostly in the North. Typically, they're going to favor the wealthy, the elite, the individuals in public office. The Republicans are led by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. They are, by comparison, pro-French. They do not like the British. Because they remember, hey, that Revolutionary War we just finished with the English, yeah, forget the English. They will support the farmer. They will favor more democratic participation. The Hamilton's program about the excise tax and whiskey. Whiskey is an interesting thing because you get whiskey from taking grain, distilling it and fermenting it and doing some magic to it, and you have whiskey. Now, if you're a farmer and you're farming grain and you want to take grain to market, you can take the grain, grind it down to flour, and once it's in flour form, it'll last a lot longer than it will as grain. The flour can be sold in bags. It can be made into bread or beer or spaghetti or, anything. The problem is it's heavy. It still has the potential to go bad. It'll last longer than the grain will, but it's not like it'll last forever kind of thing. But if you can take the grain and distill it into whiskey, it is much easier to transport. There's a lot less of it, and you can usually trade it a lot easier. I mean, a pound of flour, a bag of flour will cost you, like $1 at the grocery store, but a jug of whiskey, that'll cost you 30 bucks for something medium to low grade. That's the idea of it. I can trade, if I need to trade whiskey, I can trade one jug of whiskey for 30 bucks. I'm not going to haul around 30 bags of flour to trade if I need to. And whiskey almost had its own two currency ratio. That's how much people were using whiskey as a trading component. However, to raise money for this new republic, the excise tax is passed, and it's passed on whiskey. This is one of those things that makes a lot of sense because, like I said, it's something you need to create. It's something that has a lot of wealth wrapped up in it, and people are already exchanging whiskey for other goods like sugar or salt or maybe cod. The problem is you don't necessarily, at this time, sell whiskey for anything too much. You might sell it for by the glass in a bar. You might sell it by a shot in a hotel. But as far as I'm a farmer and I've got this jug of hooch, you're not going to be selling that. So farmers who had a lot of whiskey production might not necessarily have a lot of money to pay those taxes. And the farmers get fed up with this excise tax, with the whiskey tax, and they even rebel against, in Pennsylvania, tax collectors. And one tax collector was tarred and feathered for trying to do his job. And as we've established with tarring and feathering, this is lethal. That man died from that. When words of these rebelling farmers came to the nation's capital, the Secretary of Treasury advised the president, okay, we can't just look the other way on this. We can't just step away from this tax. We have to look strong and keep enforcing this. If the people rise up and we let them do this, we're just going to it'll be how they handle it forever. So Washington deploys the troops to Pennsylvania to put down the rebels. But it's not just that he sends in the army. He goes with them. He leads the force. The idea of commander-in-chief he took very literally. With more post offices being created, more newspapers being created, more information is going to spread as well. By the dawn of the 1790s, there are hundreds of different newspapers within the United States. And this meant if you had a perspective, opinion, idea, there was a newspaper out there that was going to reinforce what you thought and give you a place to feel like you belonged. This is going to lead to the idea of what to do for and about women. You see, women counted for representation in Congress, in the Electoral College, but they did not have the vote, and there were very few people who believed women should have the right to vote. One of the big early works on rights for women and women voting was The Vindication of the Rights of Women by Mary Wollstonecraft. And she argued that women need to be educated, they need to be paid, especially if they're single. All the work that women might do, churning butter and making clothes and cooking and cleaning, if you were married, in some cases, those were skills that a married woman might outsource and clean a neighbor's house or cook a neighbor's food in exchange for money. If you were single, this might be the only way you would be able to make any kind of money. And it wasn't right, it wasn't fair for men to be able to be the only ones who even could make money. Hannah Adams, relation to John Adams, is going to be the first woman to actually make a living by being an author, and said that we need more educational opportunities for women. At this time, public education itself did not exist. Education could exist if you could learn from home, but even for women, you were more likely to learn from an older brother who might happen to be learning math or literature or history or rhetoric or anything. That person might teach you more than anyone else. When Washington left the office of the presidency, he did so because, in his own words, he did not want to become another ruling tyrant. He knew that he could keep ruling. He knew that he could keep running for office and keep winning. But he infamously said he did not depose one tyrannical king to just become another one himself. In his farewell speech, he warns against the dangers of political parties because they can cause arguments and they can cause political ideas to be the thing that define people. He says as a nation we needed to remain neutral, not get involved in foreign alliances, foreign policies, foreign problems, and urged Americans that yes, there's going to be times we're going to fight each other, we're going to disagree with each other, but at the end of the day we're all Americans, and that sense of national unity needs to remain no matter what. With Washington gone, the presidential election that takes place in 1796 is really kind of up between Adams and Jefferson. These are the two who are running for office who are most likely going to win. And these two at one point had been the best of friends, but slowly started falling apart as friends. And it started initially over the question of, can you infer from the Constitution? Or is the Constitution something you have to literally follow? And Adams said that there is some inferencing you can do with that. And Jefferson said, no, verbatim, the Constitution is the Constitution. You can't do anything about that. And Adams becomes president. He is extremely popular when this happens in 1796. And as the system was created, the person who gets the second most number of votes becomes vice president. So John Adams is president in 1796, and Jefferson is vice president right underneath him. Over the course of the next 4 years, things between the two are going to start to get, more and more awkward. And Adams starts passing these laws that are not popular with Jefferson. For example, Adams passes the Alien and Sedition Acts. The Alien Acts said that if you were not born here and you were a potential threat, then you could be kicked out of the United States. The Sedition Act said that if you talk bad about the president, you could be arrested. And Adams passed that one specifically to shut up Jefferson and Jefferson's opponents. In 1800, the election of 1800 was really the mudslinging contest between these two. And it was bad and odd, and they started coming out with all sorts of allegations and statements about each other that, if you vote for one of them, then we're going to go to war with France. If you vote for the other one, then, well, you shouldn't, because he was deceased and he had been dead for many years. It sounds crazy and silly. And the mudslinging that happens in 1800 goes right up until the election time. And when there's no clear winner for it, the final vote in the Electoral College is going to go to Jefferson. And this is really bonkers. Thomas Jefferson becomes president and John Adams becomes vice president. And as awkward as this was before, now it's even worse. This is what's going to lead to the 12th Amendment being passed, where the president gets to decide who the vice president is. And we're not going to do any more of this craziness. When it comes to slaves at the end of the 18th century, we see there is the most successful slave revolution and rebellion in the history of the world, and that happens on Haiti. In France, we see that the French passed a document called the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, and in it says all people are equal, all people are free. And the slaves on Haiti, and Haiti was a sugar plantation that the French owned. On Haiti, the slaves there think, oh my goodness, this includes us, we're all free, hooray! And the French say, no, no, you are all still slaves. They fight back. The man depicted here, Toussaint Louverture, leads a rebellion that goes on for well over a decade before the French are finally driven from Haiti and the Haitians are free. The reaction to the Haitian rebellion is, oh my goodness, there's going to be another slave rebellion here. And there's big fears that that's going to happen. Gabriel's rebellion was a reaction to the Haitian rebellion. And the idea of Gabriel's rebellion was slaves across the South were going to rise up, collectively demand the creation of an independent black state. Unfortunately, this rise up movement didn't happen, and when Gabriel and his co-conspirators were caught, they were all hung, and stricter slave codes were put in place, some of them being that on Sundays, blacks couldn't even gather together in groups more than like 3 or 4 without a white person also there. If you own slaves and you want to free those slaves, it's a lot more difficult to do so now. Our big difference between the Haitian Revolution and Gabriel's Rebellion is the Haitian Revolution was successful and Gabriel's Rebellion was not. While president, Jefferson makes a couple of big transformational policies. First being that anyone who had been imprisoned under the Sedition Act, they're not pardoned. Jefferson makes the military a lot smaller. He gets rid of the midnight judges who were, right when John Adams was leaving as president, Adams appointed a whole bunch of federal judges who supported him, did not support Jefferson, and it took a hot minute to get those people out of office, because even though you're appointed, there's still the selection process that has to go through. And one of those judges tried to sue Madison, who was responsible for getting them out of office. Ultimately, the Supreme Court sides with Madison in the case of Marbury v. Madison and declares judiciary review. This is going to allow the court to better interpret who gets to be part of the court system. With the fact that the British Proclamation line no longer existed, there was no longer an imaginary line that said American colonists could not move west. That was now gone, and Americans had started settling west of the Appalachians pretty quickly. And we gained more territory very quickly, one of them being through Pinckney's Treaty, which gained access to the Mississippi River itself. And that was super significant because the Mississippi is a great river that runs right through the middle part of the country and empties out in New Orleans. With Pinckney's Treaty, we had access to the river, but Jefferson wants New Orleans as well. This was still part of French-controlled Louisiana, and the French Louisiana Territory was about half of the continental United States. When Napoleon wants to sell the Louisiana Territory, through some very shrewd negotiations, Jefferson buys it, and in doing so is going to double the size of this country. Expeditionary teams are led by Lewis and Clark to explore this new territory to see if there's a waterway to get to the Pacific easier. They find that there isn't, but they also find lots of new plants and animals along the way. For free blacks who were living in the Louisiana Territory, they had a lot more rights under the French and even under the Spanish, but those rights disappeared when the United States gained control of the Louisiana Territory. And this map right here really shows how big of a territory we're talking here. It's kind of surprising to think in one pen stroke, everything in that dotted section was now, ours. Jefferson was also responsible for avoiding us in some foreign affairs, specifically with the Barbary pirates. These were pirates that were based out of Tripoli who, they historically do what pirates do. They attack port towns, they attack ships that are carrying stuff, and they seize it. Stuff goes back to the Barbary coast, and a slice of the pie goes to the Sultan, who looks the other way at all of this. And when the Barbary pirates demand that we give them tribute, Jefferson responds with making the Navy much stronger. He says, we're not going to pay anything more to these pirates. We're not going to pay anything more to the Tripoli government. We are going to stand on our own, and we're not going to do this anymore. And after about 1804, the Barbary pirates no longer threaten the American coastal cities, American shipping, American anything. And this was our first real naval victory. There had been some that we saw in the Revolutionary War, but this one was ours. It was not a victory that we shared with another foreign power. Britain had continued to detain and arrest, and the term is impress, the ships and sailors and stuff that they could that was heading to Western Europe. And this was piracy. This was theft of ships and cargo, and in some cases people too. And if you were impressed by the British, you were basically forcefully enlisted into their army to fight their enemies. And at this time, their enemy was Napoleon Bonaparte, who had become Emperor of France. At its most extreme, we see that there were 6,000 American sailors who were detained and forced to work for the British Empire to fight Napoleon. And this really was huge. I mean, you can just imagine how many people we're talking about in regards to this. The Embargo Act is an act that's going to be passed by the French, and the French are trying to starve out the British, saying no one was allowed to do business trade with England. And for France, they thought this would starve out the British. And Napoleon at this time, he controls France and Spain and Prussia and Austria and a chunk of the Balkans. So doing this meant that Europe wasn't allowed to trade. Functionally, Europe was not allowed to trade with England. But him saying no one is allowed to also hurt us. We're not allowed to ship stuff to France because then the British steal it. And now France says we're not allowed to sell stuff to the British, otherwise, they're going to shoot us. So we're caught in this really crazy place between both. The decision ultimately comes down to which of these two powers are we going to listen to the most. And we decide to we're going to deal business with the French. The French are not going to try to kill us. They're not stealing people. They're not kidnapping folks. They're not impressing soldiers and sailors into their armies. And 10 years ago, it looked like, England was going to be the one that's going to survive of the two. Now it's not so sure. Our economy kind of needs trade to keep moving, just like now. So we decide to deal business with the French. And the British, as you can imagine, they don't like that at all. This leads to a declaration of war with England, and this is the War of 1812. The British didn't want us trading with France, and were so against the idea of it, they attack us. This war was called our Second War of Independence because we again had to fight the British. We're fighting them for the same reasons: self-determination, ability to do our own way. This time, though, we don't have foreign allies who have our back. It's kind of just us. This is really a devastating series of battles that we see here. At one point, the White House is burned down. A large part of Washington, D.C. was destroyed. One of the principal Native American leaders is killed at the Battle of Thames. We do see that there is the meteoric rise in popularity of Andrew Jackson, who at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend and the Battle of New Orleans turns the tide of the British assault. If the British had taken New Orleans, they would have gained access to the Mississippi River, and then they would be able to land forces on the Atlantic coast and deploy troops throughout the interior of this country. And if that had happened, we probably would not have survived. The war was expensive. It was very difficult to finance. There was no territory that we are going to gain. It just kind of ends with the Treaty of Ghent. The aftermath of the War of 1812 is the British are routed as a threat, and they're no longer a threat. The Native Americans, after losing their principal chief at Thames, he was gone, so we're seeing no threat there. We had established ourselves as an international powerhouse, so the Barbary pirates aren't even going to consider messing with us. There's this swell that we did it, we won again, and there's this giant surge in nationalism that we see. The only real downside is we expected Canada to be so in awe of us winning this war that they were going to throw off the British connections and ask to be part of the United States. That didn't happen, but we still won. Okay, so today we talked about how the United States at the end of the 18th and dawn of the 19th century became this powerhouse, how we affected international trade and politics and all that good stuff. Hope you learned something today. I'll see you next time.